There are places in this world that feel completely safe from the outside. Streets lined with ancient trees. Parks where families walk their dogs in the soft morning light. Quiet residential neighborhoods where neighbors wave over garden fences, where children ride bikes on Saturday afternoons, where life moves at the comfortable, unhurried pace of the entirely ordinary. These places carry no visible warnings. Nothing in the texture of the air tells you to be cautious. Nothing etched into the sidewalk or the soil says that something terrible has already happened here, that the ground beneath your feet is holding a story it has not yet been forced to tell. But safety is a feeling. It is not a guarantee. Interlaken Park sits on the north end of Capitol Hill in Seattle, Washington. More than 50 acres of dense, old-growth Pacific Northwest forest pressed into the middle of a living, breathing city. Trails wind between Douglas firs southwest tall and so close together that the canopy above swallows sound. Interlaken Boulevard curves through the park like a river bend, a narrow winding road permanently closed to motor vehicles, beloved by cyclists and joggers and walkers who come here for the rare urban gift of genuine quiet. Families bring strollers here. Joggers arrive before sunrise. It is the kind of place people discover and then speak about in hushed, slightly possessive tones, like they have found something the rest of the city hasn't caught on to yet. By night, it becomes something else entirely. The park borders the Montlake neighborhood, one of Seattle's older, quieter, more established residential pockets. The houses along its edges back up against the tree line. Gardens slope down toward the park's embankments. The separation between private property and public wilderness is, in some places, almost invisible. You can stand in someone's backyard and be looking directly into a darkness that the streetlights don't reach. In the spring of 2021, someone entered that darkness, or arrived at its edges through one of those private gardens, and did something that went entirely unwitnessed. Something that would remain hidden for 7 full days. Something that, as of the time this story is being told, has still never been solved. And when the truth finally broke the surface, it arrived not with the clean, resolving clarity of justice, but with questions. So many questions. Questions that the city of Seattle, and the people tasked with answering them, have not yet answered, and may never answer. This is not a story about a stranger in the shadows. It is something more complicated and more troubling than that. It is a story about what happens when a city looks away from one of its own. About what happens when a woman spends years fighting her way toward a life she can finally be proud of, and the world does not stop moving long enough to notice when she is taken from it. It is a story about painting found beside a shallow stream. About a daughter who kept calling a number that no longer rang. About a family in Texas watching the silence stretch longer and longer with each passing week, not yet understanding that what they were feeling was grief, because nobody had called them yet to tell them why. This is Necia's story. And before we go any further, before this story takes the turns it is about to take, I want to ask you something. What device are you using right now? Phone under the covers. Tablet on the couch. Desktop with headphones on so nobody knows what you're actually watching. Drop your location and your setup in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them. And if you are here because you care about stories like this, stories that deserve to be told, people whose names deserve to be said out loud, please take 5 seconds right now to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another one. It matters more than you know. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Necia Marie McKendrick was born in Texas into the kind of family that fills every room it enters. Large, loud in the best possible sense, full of people who argued with one another because they loved one another, and who showed up for each other in the ways that counted. She grew up with her mother Raymond, 5 sisters, and 2 brothers, a network of blood and loyalty that stretched wide and deep and that would, in the years to come, be the thing that refused to let her story be forgotten. She was, by every account from people who loved her, impossible to ignore. She moved through the world with an energy that people remembered after she left the room. She was funny. She was bold. She was the kind of person who said the thing nobody else would say, and somehow made everyone laugh while she said it. She had 3 children. She had a daughter named Sapphire who adored her with the kind of uncomplicated devotion that daughters sometimes have for mothers they are also desperately worried about. She had family. She had people who called to check on her, people who lit up when her name appeared on their phone screens, people whose days were measurably better when she was in them. But Necia also carried things. Heavy things. She had struggled with her mental health for years, something her family spoke about with the kind of open, unsentimental honesty that comes only from love that has already been tested to its limits. She had battled addiction. These were not secrets they tried to keep. They were part of who she was, part of the story of a woman who had faced hard things and kept getting up anyway. Her sister and Wolf Anderson would later describe the particular kind of fear that sits in the chest of someone who loves an addict, that constant low hum of worry, the way you learn to hold hope at arm's length so it doesn't take you down with it if something goes wrong. But something had shifted in the period before 2021. Something had begun to change. Necia had found painting. I don't know where she found that passion to paint, her daughter Sapphire would later say. The words came out slowly, with the careful weight of someone trying to articulate something that mattered deeply. It takes me so long to find the willingness to be creative, but she just oozed it. Necia had become an artist. Not in a gallery. Not in a studio. On the street. On Broadway in Capitol Hill, one of Seattle's most alive, most electric, most unapologetically itself neighborhoods, she had set up on the sidewalk and let the world come to her. She sold her paintings right there, near Dick's Drive-In, the Seattle institution that has occupied the same corner of Broadway for decades and that draws the full cross-section of city life at all hours. Necia became part of that cross-section. She was known. She was recognized. She had a name in the community, and she wore it like something she had earned. They called her Q. Or Queen. Both names fit her in ways that told you something true about who she was. There was a kind of regal self-possession in the way she carried herself, even when life was not being generous, even on the days when the ordinary cruelties of a precarious life piled up and weighed on her. She moved within the circles of buskers and street artists, within the transient communities that orbit Capitol Hill's edges, within the loose but real ecosystem of people who live outside the conventional structures and make something beautiful anyway. She volunteered in food pantries. She mentored young people who were struggling with the same things she had struggled with. She sponsored others in their recovery, offering her own hard-won experience as something tangible they could hold on to. From her great love of people, her family would later write, she boisterously created community. Seattle was not new to Necia. She had traveled there before, drawn back repeatedly by something she found in the city that she didn't find everywhere. Capitol Hill specifically felt like hers, its acceptance of the unconventional, its tolerance for people who didn't fit the neat molds of suburban expectation, its history of being a place where the margins of society could exist with some dignity. She had settled back in, recently, and was in the process of building something real. She saw people busking weren't treated like they were in Texas, her sister and explained. She saw an opportunity, even if she was living on the fringes. Living on the fringes. It's a phrase worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about the shape of Necia's life in Seattle in the spring of 2021. She was not living in an apartment with a fixed address. Her world was fluid. She spent time in Interlaken Park. She spent time in the surrounding green spaces of Capitol Hill. She moved. She was known in her community, but she was not anchored in the way that makes someone easy to track or easy to find when they go quiet. Her life had its own geography, a geography that the people who loved her could feel but not always map. Her family loved her fiercely. Her community knew her and valued her. And she was, for the first time in what had been a long and difficult road, getting somewhere. She really was working towards something, and said, her voice holding the weight of someone who believes this with everything in her. She finally felt free to do the things that were in her. It really looks like she was just getting started. Just getting started. Hold on to that. Because within a matter of weeks, everything would stop. The last time anyone who has been publicly named confirmed seeing Necia McKendrick was April 30, 2021. After that date, the record goes quiet. Her daughter Sapphire noticed first, the phone calls stopped coming. The regular check-ins that had been a rhythm between them, a thread connecting Seattle and Texas across 2,000 miles of distance, went silent. And Sapphire, the way daughters do when they love a mother who has had complicated stretches, probably told herself a story about why. Maybe Necia was busy. Maybe she was deep in a project, in a stretch of productivity, painting through the afternoons and the evenings with that intensity her daughter had described, just oozing it. Maybe she had met someone new, or found a new spot for her work, or was simply in one of those periods where the outside world receded and the art took over. But the days kept passing. And the phone kept not ringing. And the silence had a weight to it that grew heavier with each day that it continued. What nobody knew yet, what nobody could have known, because nobody had gone looking in the right place, was that somewhere in the 50-plus acres of Interlaken Park, or at its edges, or somewhere in that quiet residential borderland where the gardens of Montlake sloped down into the tree line, something had already happened. The calendar would later suggest it happened around May 23rd. 7 days before anyone found her. 7 days during which Seattle kept moving, Capitol Hill kept humming, people walked their dogs on Interlaken Boulevard and cycled its curves and lived their ordinary lives within a few hundred yards of something that would, when it finally came to light, stop people cold. The question of what happened in those 7 days, and in the 30 days before them, is the question that has never been answered. And that is where this story is going next. Sunday, May 30th, 2021. The morning light in Seattle in late May has a particular quality, pale and clean and slightly diffuse, the kind of light that makes the city look like a watercolor that hasn't quite dried yet. In the Montlake neighborhood, one of Seattle's older and more established residential areas, the day was beginning in the ordinary way. People were waking up. Coffee was being made. Somewhere along the tree-lined edge where the back gardens of Montlake property sloped down toward the forest of Interlaken Park, a homeowner stepped outside. What they saw at the bottom of the embankment, in the shallow stream that runs below the property line, where the garden meets the wild, stopped them completely. The details of that moment, the 911 call that followed, have not been released in full to the public. What is known is what the call set in motion. Seattle Police Department units responded to the location. Officers moved through the garden, down the embankment, toward the stream. And there, in a narrow strip of water barely wide enough to matter, they found the body of a woman. She was 45 years old. Her name was Necia McKendrick. She was lying where the current had no force, in water that didn't move. And beside her, this is the detail that would settle into the minds of everyone who heard it, that would stay there long after the other facts had been organized and filed, there was a bag. And inside the bag were pieces of her artwork. Her paintings. Carried with her. The scene itself told a story, but it was a story with pieces missing, large, crucial pieces that investigators would spend the days and weeks ahead trying to locate. The first thing that police noted, and that would become one of the central puzzles of this case, was the access problem. There was, according to investigators, no obvious route to the location where Necia's body was found that didn't pass through private property. The stream sat below a private garden. To reach it from the park side would have required navigating terrain that most people would not navigate casually. Whoever had been at that stream had known how to get there, or had access through the garden itself. Forensic examination of the body revealed multiple blunt force injuries. The medical examiner's findings, as reported through the investigation, pointed to a violent death, the kind of physical force that does not suggest accident, does not suggest something impersonal or incidental. Blunt force trauma, inflicted multiple times, is the signature of close contact. It is the signature of presence. Of proximity. Of someone near enough to cause that kind of harm. The estimated date of death, as established through forensic analysis, was approximately May 23rd, a week before the body was found. Which means that Necia McKendrick had been lying in that stream, in that narrow strip of water at the bottom of a private garden in a quiet residential neighborhood in Seattle, for 7 days before anyone discovered her. 7 days of dog walkers on Interlaken Boulevard. 7 days of joggers and cyclists on the park's trails. 7 days of life continuing normally within earshot of something that had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. That detail alone, 7 days, has a weight to it that is difficult to hold. Seattle police detectives assigned to the homicide began the work that homicide detectives do. They canvassed the neighborhood. They began building a timeline, working backward from May 30th, trying to establish where Necia had been, who had seen her, who she had been with. The last confirmed public sighting was April 30th, a full month before her body was found, and more than 3 weeks before her estimated date of death. Between April 30th and May 23rd, there is a gap in the publicly known record that has never been filled. 23 days. Who saw her during those 23 days? Who spoke to her? Who knew where she was sleeping, where she was working, who she was spending her time with? These are the questions that investigators would have been urgently asking in June 2021. And these are the questions that, years later, remain without public answers. There is something uniquely painful about a missing persons case that nobody reported as missing. Necia's family in Texas had noticed the silence, her daughter Sapphire had felt the wrongness of it building across the weeks of May. But the gap between noticing something feels wrong and making an official report, between the private fear that sits in the stomach and the formal declaration that puts a name into a system, that gap is wide. Especially across 2,000 miles of distance. Especially when the person you're worried about has a history of hard stretches, of periods when contact goes thin, when she goes inward for a while and then surfaces again on the other side. Sapphire had lived through those periods before. She had learned to hold hope at an arm's length, just like her aunts had learned. She had probably told herself the same things daughters tell themselves. That her mother was okay. That she would call soon. That the silence didn't mean what the silence sometimes meant. By the time the body was identified and the family in Texas was notified, by the time the phone call came that every family member of someone living on the margins fears more than almost anything, Necia had already been gone for days. Her family had been living, unknowingly, inside their grief for weeks. They just hadn't known what to call it yet. The impact of that realization, that they had been worrying for the right reasons all along, that the silence had meant exactly what they feared, is the kind of thing that doesn't have a word in any language that feels adequate. Her sister described Necia's life in Seattle with a combination of admiration and heartbreak. She understood what Necia had been building there. She had seen it, or felt it across the phone calls and the updates, her sister finally finding a place where her creativity was welcomed, where she could stand on a corner and show people what she had made and have them stop and look. That was real. That mattered. And now it was gone, and nobody could tell them why. She finally felt free, and said, "And now we can't even get answers." The Seattle Police Department, for their part, confirmed the homicide and issued an appeal for public assistance. They confirmed the last known sighting on April 30th. They asked anyone with information to come forward. But the updates that followed were limited. The nature of an open investigation means that much of what detectives know cannot be shared publicly, leads being pursued, persons of interest being assessed, evidence being processed, but the family and the community that had known Necia felt the silence from the department acutely. In the weeks and months that followed, as the initial news coverage faded and the algorithm moved on to the next story, the case settled into the territory that too many homicide cases occupy, known but unanswered. Named but unsolved. There are reasons why cases like Necia's are harder to solve than cases that make front pages and dominate news cycles for months. Investigators will not say this publicly, but criminologists and journalists and advocates who study patterns in homicide clearance rates will. When a victim is living a transient lifestyle, sleeping rough, moving through overlapping and shifting communities, without a fixed address or a regular employer or a structured set of daily relationships that can be mapped and traced, the investigative tools that work in most cases work less reliably. Surveillance cameras that might capture someone's movements are only useful if you know which cameras to pull. Phone records are only traceable if there is a phone with a registered number. Witnesses who might have seen something are only witnesses if they come forward, and in communities where trust in law enforcement is complicated, where many people have their own reasons to avoid official attention, the threshold for coming forward is higher than most people understand. None of this means the case is impossible. But it means that solving it requires something more than standard procedure. It requires someone who was there, someone who saw something, someone who knows something they have perhaps spent 3 years telling themselves is not their business, to make a decision to speak. That person exists. Almost certainly. Someone in Seattle, or someone who has since left Seattle, carries a piece of this story that has never been told. And everything that follows in this investigation rests on whether that person ever decides to pick up the phone. But before we get to the investigation, before we get to the questions that still don't have answers, there is something that needs to be said about Necia McKendrick that gets lost when cases like this are reduced to their facts. There is something about who she was that the crime reports and the police appeals and the news articles don't quite capture. Something that her family understood, that her community on Broadway understood, that her daughter Sapphire understood in the way that only a daughter can. Necia McKendrick made things. She took paint and surface and time and she made things that other people wanted to look at. She stood on a sidewalk on Broadway and she offered those things to strangers, not from desperation but from pride. Art made her feel relevant, her sister said. Think about that word. Relevant. Not just alive. Not just present. Relevant. Like her existence was connected to the world around her in a way that she could see and measure and feel. That is not a small thing. For someone who had spent years fighting through darkness, through addiction, through the kind of mental health struggles that can make a person feel invisible even in a crowded room, the feeling of relevance, of being connected and seen and valued, that is enormous. That is everything. She was getting there. She was building it. Piece by piece, painting by painting, sidewalk conversation by sidewalk conversation, she was constructing a version of her life that finally felt like hers. And then, in the space of one estimated date on a forensic report, somewhere between May 23rd and a quiet stream below a private garden in Montlake, it ended. What happened in those 23 days between the last confirmed sighting and the estimated date of death? Where was she? Who was with her? What changed between April 30th and the moment that everything stopped? That is the question at the center of this case. And that is where we are going now. To understand the geography of the last month of Necia McKendrick's life, you have to understand Capitol Hill in 2021. You have to understand what the neighborhood was, and what it was going through, and what it meant to be living on its edges during that particular spring in that particular city. Capitol Hill is Seattle's most densely populated neighborhood, a square mile of density and contradiction. Expensive coffee shops 2 doors down from drug treatment facilities, art galleries adjacent to tent encampments, queer nightlife venues on the same block as family-owned restaurants that have been there since the 1970s. It is a neighborhood that has always prided itself on its tolerance, its openness, its willingness to be complicated. It is also a neighborhood where the gap between the comfortable and the precarious has been visibly, painfully widening for years, where gentrification has pushed the people who made the neighborhood interesting toward its margins and sometimes off the map entirely. In the summer of 2020, less than a year before Necia's death, Capitol Hill had been the site of the Capitol Hill Organized Protest Zone, sometimes called CHOP or CHAZ, a weeks-long occupation of several blocks following protests over the murder of George Floyd. The relationship between the community and the Seattle Police Department was, in the spring of 2021, under a level of strain that was difficult to overstate. Many people in the neighborhood, including many people in the transient and street artist communities that Necia moved within, had reasons, personal and political and historical, to be cautious about engaging with law enforcement. Even as witnesses. Even with information that might matter. This context matters because it shapes the investigative environment into which Necia's case was born. The Seattle Police Department was understaffed, under scrutiny, and under political pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The neighborhood where Necia had been living and working was one where trust between community and police was not a given. It was something that had to be actively built, and that in many cases had been actively eroded. And the community that had known Necia best, the street artists, the buskers, the people who lived and slept and survived in the parks and the margins of Capitol Hill, was a community with every reason to be cautious about what it shared and with whom. None of this is an excuse for what followed. None of this explains why, more than 3 years later, there has been no arrest and no named suspect in the murder of Necia McKendrick. But it is part of the picture. It is part of the reason why cases like this one, cases that happen to people on the margins, in communities with complicated relationships with law enforcement, in cities dealing with their own internal fractures, are harder to close. The physical geography of the crime matters too. Interlaken Park is not a remote wilderness. It is 50-plus acres of urban forest, yes, but it is surrounded on all sides by the dense residential fabric of Seattle. Montlake to the north and east. Capitol Hill to the south. Washington Park Arboretum to the east. On any given day, dozens or hundreds of people pass through or around its edges. The park has trails that connect to the broader neighborhood trail network. It has entry points that are casual and easy. It is, in every sense, accessible. And yet the specific location where Necia's body was found, below an embankment, in a shallow stream, accessible only through private property, is a location that most people would never go. It requires either local knowledge, specific navigation, or the kind of intentional movement that suggests someone who knew exactly where they were going. Police noted there was no obvious access route to the scene except through the homeowner's garden. That observation alone is quietly devastating in its implications. However Necia ended up in that stream, whether she was killed there or moved there afterward, somebody brought her to a place that required knowledge of how to reach it. That means something. That is the kind of detail that investigators turn over and over in interviews, in the small hours of the night, because it narrows the universe of possible explanations in ways that are both clarifying and alarming. Was Necia's body moved to that location after she was killed somewhere else? Or did she end up there because she knew the terrain herself, because she had spent time in that park, camping or resting, as people who live rough in urban parks often do, and was killed in the place where she already was. These are two very different scenarios, and they point toward two very different kinds of killers. If she was moved, if the stream was a deliberate disposal site chosen by someone who knew how to reach it without being observed, that implies planning. It implies someone who thought about what they were doing, at least enough to choose a location that wouldn't be easily found. It implies knowledge of the specific terrain, of which gardens backed up against which embankments, of how to move through the private property without attracting attention. That is not a profile that fits random opportunistic violence. If she was not moved, if she died where she was found, then the question becomes what she was doing there. Was she camping in that area? Had she established a sleeping spot near the stream? Did someone follow her there, or did she bring someone there? The presence of her bag and her artwork suggests that she had not been robbed, that whatever happened was not primarily motivated by taking what she had. Which means the motivation came from somewhere else, from a relationship, from a conflict, from something personal that has not yet been named publicly. The bag, specifically, deserves a moment of attention. When someone is killed, the things they leave behind become evidence, not just forensic evidence, but narrative evidence. The things a person carries tell you something about where they expected to be going. Necia was carrying her artwork. She was carrying the thing that defined her in this chapter of her life, the thing she sold on Broadway, the thing that made her feel relevant. She had that with her when she died. Which means she was, in some sense, in working mode. She was the artist, she was Q, she was the person who moved through the world with paintings in her bag, ready to show them to someone. Was she on her way to sell work? Was she meeting someone? Was the bag simply always with her because her art was always with her? The fact that the bag was left at the scene, undisturbed, according to reports, still containing her paintings, reinforces the interpretation that robbery was not the motive. Nobody took the bag. Nobody went through it looking for money or anything of value. It was left there, alongside her, like it was part of a scene that someone arranged or didn't bother to disturb. These details do not answer the central question. They only make the shape of the question clearer. They only make the silence around the answer louder. Her family in Texas was learning these details in the weeks after her body was identified, absorbing information in pieces, through phone calls from detectives and through news reports they found online and through the particular agony of trying to understand something violent and incomprehensible from 2,000 miles away. Her sisters were in contact with investigators. Her daughter Sapphire was processing the grief of realizing that the calls had stopped because her mother was already gone, that the silence she had lived inside for a month had been a different kind of silence than she had imagined. She was really something, Sapphire said, in the way people speak about someone when they are trying to compress an entire relationship into a sentence because nothing longer will hold. The admiration in her voice was real. The love was real. The bewilderment, that particular quality of grief that comes from murder, from the understanding that someone chose to do this, was real too. The family did what families in impossible situations do. They held on to each other. They made public appeals. They pushed for answers. They created a GoFundMe for Necia's funeral arrangements, framed around the understanding that Necia had left this world too soon under violent circumstances, and that she was being remembered for her creativity, her community building, her love of people, and her identity as Q, as the Queen of Broadway who stood on the sidewalk with her paintings and offered them to the world. Hundreds of people who had known her in Seattle, or known of her, responded. The street art community on Capitol Hill, the busking community, the circles she had moved within, they grieved her in the way tight communities grieve, loudly, publicly, with anger mixed into the sadness. But the investigation did not match the community's intensity. Updates were sparse. The public record of what police were doing, who they were looking at, what leads they were following, that record was thin. This is not necessarily a sign of inaction. Homicide investigations are confidential by necessity, and disclosing what you know can compromise the work before it's finished. But from the family's perspective, from the community's perspective, the absence of visible progress felt like something. Like the case was already at risk of going cold. Like Necia McKendrick, who had fought her whole life to matter, to be seen, to be relevant, was already beginning to become invisible again. That fear, the fear that this is how it ends, with questions that never get answered, is the thing that Necia's family carries into every new day that passes without an arrest. And somewhere in Seattle, or somewhere that person has since traveled to, someone is carrying something too. A piece of information. A memory. A name. Something they saw on the evening of May 23rd, or in the days that surrounded it, that they have not shared with anyone who can act on it. The question of why they haven't spoken is one only they can answer. The question of whether they ever will is the one that this family is waiting on. The number to call, if you know anything, if you have seen anything, if you have heard anything, is the Seattle Police Department tip line at 206-233-5000. Say her name. Say Necia. Say Q, say Queen. Someone will listen. But the investigation itself, the shape it took, the directions it went, the obstacles it ran into, that is what we need to look at carefully now. Because the way this case was handled tells you as much about the difficulty of the problem as it does about the effort put into solving it. The first theory, in almost every homicide case, is the one that makes the most immediate sense from the outside looking in. It is the theory that the available facts support before anyone has done the deeper work of pulling at threads. And in the case of Necia McKendrick, the first theory was the one that her circumstances seemed to suggest almost automatically, that she had been the victim of opportunistic violence, of the kind that disproportionately claims lives lived on the edges of urban spaces. It was not an unreasonable place to start. People who live rough in urban parks and green spaces are, statistically, more vulnerable to violence than people who live in stable housing. The isolation of those spaces, the way that density and anonymity coexist in a city park in a way that can make a person simultaneously surrounded by others and completely alone, creates conditions in which bad things can happen without witnesses. The blunt force nature of Necia's injuries was consistent with the kind of violent encounter that can happen when desperation meets vulnerability, when someone in the grip of whatever drives a person to do harm finds themselves in proximity to someone whose life circumstances make them harder to protect. That theory had a logic to it. It also had, for the investigators who were looking carefully at the evidence, some problems. The first problem was the bag. The artwork. In a robbery-adjacent scenario, in a scenario where someone attacked Necia for what she had, the bag doesn't get left behind. It gets taken, or rifled through, or at minimum disturbed in ways that the scene apparently did not show. The bag being left, the paintings being left, suggests that whoever did this either did not want what she had, or was too focused on something else to think about it. The second problem was the location. Opportunistic violence tends to happen where opportunity presents itself, in the flow of a space, in a moment of encounter that wasn't planned. The specific location where Necia's body was found was not the kind of place you stumble into accidentally. Getting to the stream below the embankment in a private garden required a level of navigation that doesn't fit the profile of a random encounter. Somebody was moving deliberately. The third problem was the nature of the injuries themselves. Multiple blunt force wounds speak to something more sustained than a single explosive moment of violence. They speak to repeated force, to something that unfolded over time rather than in an instant. Forensic pathologists will tell you, carefully, in the language of science, that the pattern of injuries can sometimes suggest something about the emotional state of the person who caused them. Not always. Context always matters. But repeated blunt force trauma, to a 45-year-old woman in a location that required deliberate navigation, is not a pattern that points cleanly toward the stranger in the night scenario. It points somewhere more uncomfortable. The family had their own theories. They had their own knowledge of Necia's life, the people she had been around, the relationships she had been in, the parts of her world that had sometimes worried them. They shared what they knew with investigators. Exactly what they shared has not been made fully public. But the family's account of Necia's life in Seattle, the community she moved within, the people she knew, the specific dynamics of her social world in those months before her death, would have been one of the primary starting points for detectives trying to understand who might have had cause, real or imagined, to harm her. Blunt force homicide, when it is not random, and increasingly the evidence suggested this was not random, is almost always personal. The word personal in this context doesn't necessarily mean romantic. It means someone who knew the victim. Someone who had a grievance, real or perceived. Someone who had shared space with Necia, who had been part of her world in some way, who had been inside the geography of her life, who knew enough about her routines and her movements to find her in a place that a stranger would not have known to look. That narrows the field. It narrows it considerably. And it raises the question that will not leave this case alone, the question that sits at the center of everything, of who in Necia's life in Seattle might have had reason to want her gone. Here is what is publicly known about Necia's social world in Seattle in the spring of 2021, she moved primarily within the street artist and busking communities of Capitol Hill, particularly along Broadway. She was known in those communities, recognized and respected in the way that someone who has built a real presence in a specific subculture becomes known. She was also connected to the communities of people who live rough in the parks and green spaces of Capitol Hill, people who use Interlaken Park and the surrounding areas as shelter and gathering space. She was, by accounts of people who knew her, someone who made connections easily, who was open and generous and social. Being social and open and generous, in a community where people are sometimes desperate and sometimes dangerous, is not always safe. It means you know a lot of people. It means those people know your routines. It means the universe of people who might have had access to you, who might have known where you slept, where you went during the day, who you met and when, is larger than it would be for someone who moved through a smaller, more enclosed social world. Investigators looking for a starting point would have been mapping that social universe. Who had Necia been seen with in April? Who had she been close to in the weeks before her last confirmed sighting? Were there conflicts? Arguments? Anyone who had expressed anger toward her, or whom she had expressed fear of? Were there any reports, any community knowledge, of tension or threat? These questions are the ones that door-to-door canvassing is designed to surface. In a community where people will talk, where people trust the process enough to answer honestly, canvassing works. In a community where trust is compromised, where people have their own complicated histories with law enforcement, where the culture is to handle things internally, where coming forward feels more dangerous than staying quiet, canvassing produces partial answers at best. The Seattle Police Department put out its public appeal for tips in June 2021. They confirmed the timeline they had established, last seen April 30th, estimated death around May 23rd, found May 30th, and they asked anyone with information to contact detectives. The response to that appeal, in terms of what it produced for the investigation, has not been publicly characterized. What is known is that in the months and years that followed, no arrest was made. No named suspect was publicly announced. The case remained open and unresolved. In December 2024, nearly 3.5 years after Necia's body was found, local news station Q13 Fox ran a segment on the case. The segment confirmed that the homicide remained unsolved and that investigators were still seeking information from the public. The tip line was shared again. Her family's pain was revisited. Her name was said on television again, which is something her family had to be grateful for, even though it came with the reminder that nothing had changed. 3.5 years. No arrest. No named suspect. A family in Texas still waiting. In 2024, the case was described by a local outlet as going cold. That phrase has a technical meaning in investigative contexts. It refers to the diminishing return on active investigative effort as time passes, as witnesses become harder to reach, as memories fade, as the people who might have had information move on or change or decide they are done with the question of whether to speak. Going cold doesn't mean dead. It doesn't mean impossible. Cases go cold and then break open on the basis of a single phone call from someone who has been carrying knowledge for years and finally decides they can't carry it anymore. It happens. It is not common, but it happens. And Necia's case is one that, by every account of the people who loved her, deserves to be one of those cases. Deserves the phone call. Deserves the break. But the honest truth, the truth that investigators know and that the family knows and that anyone who spends time with the publicly available record of this case will eventually arrive at, is that right now, 3+ years in, whoever did this to Necia McKendrick is still free. Still living their life. Still breathing. That is not an easy thing to say. But it is the truth of where this case stands. Let's talk about the theories that exist, the ones that are spoken about by people who have followed this case, by the true crime community that has engaged with it, by the family members who have spent years trying to construct a picture of what might have happened from the pieces of information they have been given. These are theories. They are not accusations. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been named. The investigation remains open, and that means the possibility that any theory, including the most obvious-seeming one, is completely wrong. In an unsolved case, certainty is the enemy of truth. So what follows is an honest examination of the possibilities, held open-handedly, with the full understanding that only evidence can determine what actually happened. The first and most discussed possibility is that Necia was killed by someone she knew. Not a stranger. Not random violence. Someone from within her world, from the social circles of Capitol Hill's street communities, from the relationships she had built and maintained during her time in Seattle. The reasoning behind this theory is grounded in the physical evidence, the location, the method, the fact that the bag was left behind. These details, taken together, point toward a killing that was not about what Necia had, but about something else. Something relational. Something personal. Blunt force trauma between people who know each other, between people who have a history, who have grievances, who have been in the kind of proximity that breeds either intimacy or conflict or both, is the most common presentation of this kind of violence in homicide statistics. This is not speculation. This is pattern. When investigators see multiple blunt force injuries, their first question is always who was close enough to do this and angry enough to sustain it. The second possibility, less frequently discussed but not dismissible, is that Necia encountered someone who targeted her specifically because of her vulnerability. Because she was living rough. Because she was alone. Because she was in a space that offered the person who harmed her cover and isolation. This is opportunistic violence, but not random in the conventional sense. It is targeted in the sense of selecting for vulnerability rather than selecting a specific person. There are individuals, in every city, in every era, who commit violence against people on the margins precisely because they understand that those people are less likely to be protected, less likely to have their cases investigated with the same urgency, less likely to generate the sustained public pressure that keeps investigators accountable. It is painful to say that. But it is true. And the history of violent crimes against people experiencing homelessness or near homelessness in American cities supports it. The third possibility is the most logistically complex, that Necia was killed somewhere other than where she was found, and that her body was moved to the stream. The problem of access, the absence of any obvious route to the scene except through private property, could be explained in two ways. Either the killer knew how to navigate the terrain, or the killer had access to the private property itself. If Necia's body was moved, carried or transported from somewhere else to the stream, that movement required either physical effort and local knowledge, or access through the garden that borders the site. This possibility implies planning. It implies that someone thought about what they were doing, at least in the immediate aftermath of the killing. That they chose the stream as a place where discovery would be delayed. That they understood the terrain well enough to move through it without attracting attention. That is a different level of premeditation than the heat of an argument, and it changes the profile of who investigators should be looking for. What the evidence cannot tell us, from the publicly available record, is which of these possibilities, or which combination of them, describes what actually happened. That is the information gap. That is the open loop that this case has been living inside for 3.5 years. What the evidence can tell us is this: Necia McKendrick was 45 years old. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, an artist. She was killed with force, with proximity, in a location that required knowledge or access. Her artwork was left with her. She had not been seen, according to public records, for 30 days before her body was found. And in the month between her last confirmed sighting and her death, something happened that no one has yet been willing or able to explain on the record. The community that knew her on Broadway has not forgotten. In the weeks after her death, people who had bought her paintings or watched her work or simply spoken with her on the sidewalk came forward to share what she had meant to them. There was grief on Capitol Hill that was specific to her, specific to Q, to Queen, to the woman who stood there with her canvases and her warmth and her pride. People posted about her online. Her family's GoFundMe was shared widely. The street artist community held space for her in the way that communities do when they lose someone who was woven into the fabric of the place. But grief and justice are not the same thing. And the grief has had 3.5 years to outlast the news cycle, to become something that lives in the background while the foreground fills with other stories, other names, other cases. The algorithm does not hold vigil. The news does not circle back. And the family in Texas, Sapphire, Ann, the brothers and sisters and the mother who lost her daughter, they are left holding something that the city of Seattle has not helped them put down. We just want answers, and said, in words that could stand for every family who has ever waited in this particular kind of not knowing. We just want someone to tell us what happened to her. That sentence is not asking for comfort. It is not asking for sympathy, though sympathy is freely given. It is asking for a fact. A specific, verifiable, prosecutable fact about what happened to Necia McKendrick between April 30th and May 23, 2021, in the parks and streets and margins of Capitol Hill, Seattle. It is asking for someone to have the courage to tell the truth. The case tip line for the Seattle Police Department is 20623350000. You can also submit tips anonymously. If you know something, if you were in that community in that spring, if you saw something, heard something, knew someone who came back changed or nervous or different after that estimated date of May 23rd, please call. Please. Say her name. Say Necia. They will listen. But there is one more dimension of this case that has not yet been fully examined here, one that is important not because it provides answers, but because it explains part of the silence. And that is the question of who gets attention. There is a documented, studied, heavily argued about phenomenon in American criminal justice that researchers and advocates call missing white woman syndrome. The term is deliberately blunt, and the reality it describes is equally blunt. The cases that receive saturation media coverage, the ones that generate the FBI task forces and the cable news panels and the viral social media attention, are disproportionately cases involving white women, usually young, usually conventionally attractive, usually from stable middle-class circumstances. The cases that receive less attention, far less, sometimes almost none, are disproportionately cases involving people of color, cases involving people experiencing poverty or houselessness, cases involving people whose lives were lived outside the zones of respectability that the media and the public feel most comfortable protecting. Necia McKendrick was a black woman. She was 45. She was living on the margins of Capitol Hill, sleeping in parks, selling art on sidewalks. By every metric of the documented disparity in media attention to missing and murdered people in America, her case was likely to receive less coverage than it deserved. And the record confirms this. In the weeks after her body was found, there was local coverage, Capitol Hill, Seattle, Q13 Fox, a few other outlets. Her family's appeal was covered. The GoFundMe circulated. But there was no sustained national attention. No weeks-long cable news coverage. No viral moment that put her name in front of millions of people who might have had or shared information. The true crime community has, in recent years, developed a growing awareness of this disparity and a growing commitment to addressing it, to choosing to cover cases that the mainstream media has ignored, to saying names that the algorithm has never amplified, to making sure that the stories of people like Necia get the attention that the stories of people in more privileged circumstances automatically receive. This video is part of that effort. This name being said here, Necia McKendrick, Queen, mother, sister, artist, is part of that effort. But awareness of the disparity does not fix the disparity. And the family of Necia McKendrick is living the reality of what it feels like to be on the wrong side of it. We still don't have answers, and said. The simplicity of the sentence holds everything. It holds 3.5 years. It holds a daughter who picked up the phone and put it down and picked it up again across a month of May before she finally got a call she hadn't wanted. It holds a mother who lost a child. It holds 5 sisters and 2 brothers and 3 grandchildren and a community on Broadway that still sells art on that sidewalk, that still knows who Q was, that still holds the space where she used to stand. It holds a painting inside a bag, lying in a shallow stream, found 7 days after it was left there. There is something about that image, the art found with her, preserved in the bag, carried to wherever she went last, that says something true about Necia McKendrick. She didn't go anywhere without her work. She didn't separate herself from the thing that had given her back a sense of who she was. Even at the end, in circumstances that are still unknown, she had her paintings with her. She was still Q. She was still the artist. She was still, in some essential and irreducible way, herself. The paintings have not been publicly described in detail. What they looked like, what subjects or colors or techniques she favored, that record is not well documented in what has been publicly shared. What is known is that she made them, that she sold them, that people bought them and valued them enough to exchange money for them on a sidewalk in Capitol Hill. What is known is that her daughter saw her creativity and was moved by it. What is known is that her sister believed the art gave her relevance, gave her the feeling of existing in connection with the world, of being part of something that mattered. If you bought a painting from a woman who called herself Q on Broadway in Capitol Hill, if you stopped to talk to her, if you remember her, then you hold a piece of who she was. And maybe you hold something else too. Maybe you remember something about the weeks before May 2021 that you have never told anyone. Maybe you remember a name she mentioned, a person she was wary of, a situation she described. Maybe that thing you remember has been sitting in the back of your mind for 3 years, and this is the moment it moves forward. The tip line is 20623350000. Anonymously. You don't have to give your name. You just have to give what you know. Now, before the last section of this story, if you've stayed with this all the way through, if Necia's story has moved you or angered you or made you want to make sure her name doesn't disappear again, please take this moment to share this video. Send it to someone. Post it. Not for the algorithm. For her. For her family. For the off chance that the right person sees it and makes the call. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. Let's go back to what we know one more time, because the structure of what is known and what is not known in this case deserves to be stated clearly and completely, without softening, before we reach the end. What is confirmed, Necia McKendrick was 45 years old when she was killed. She was a black woman, a mother of 3, originally from Texas, known in Seattle's Capitol Hill community as Q or Queen. She sold artwork on Broadway. She struggled with mental health and addiction and had, in the period before her death, found in painting a sense of purpose and identity that her family described as transformative. She was last publicly confirmed seen on April 30, 2021. Her estimated date of death is approximately May 23, 2021. Her body was found on May 30, 2021, by a homeowner in the Montlake neighborhood of Seattle, in a shallow stream below an embankment, accessible only through private property. She had multiple blunt force injuries. Her bag was with her, containing her artwork. No robbery is indicated by the scene. What is not confirmed, publicly, who killed her? What happened in the 23 days between April 30th and May 23rd? Whether she was killed where she was found or moved there afterward. Whether there are named persons of interest in the investigation. What specific leads, if any, investigators are currently pursuing. Whether the case is being actively worked or is, as the 2024 reporting suggested, effectively cold. What is needed? Information. Specifically, information from anyone who was in the Capitol Hill street artist or outdoor communities in the spring of 2021, who saw Necia after April 30th, who knows what happened to her or who she was with or what her circumstances were in the days leading up to May 23rd. This is the architecture of the unsolved case. It is a case defined by what is missing as much as by what is known. Every unsolved murder is a story with a chapter torn out. And the chapter that is missing from Necia's story is the one that contains the name of the person who ended it. The family has not stopped. And Wolf Anderson has not stopped speaking Necia's name in public contexts. Sapphire has not stopped. The sisters and brothers who make up the extended McKendrick family in Texas have not stopped. They have made appeals. They have engaged with the true crime community. They have provided interviews. They have done everything that a family without the resources of wealth or platform can do to keep a case alive in the public consciousness, to keep the name circulating, to prevent the quiet erasure that happens to so many cases involving people who lived on the margins. There is something specific about grief that comes from murder, and something more specific still about grief that comes from unsolved murder. Ordinary grief, if such a thing exists, has a shape to it, it moves through stages, it shifts and settles, it becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. Grief from murder has a different texture, it is punctuated by the knowledge that someone chose this, that it was not random chance or illness or accident, that there is a person alive in the world who knows what happened and is not being held accountable for it. And grief from unsolved murder is that, multiplied by the open loop that never closes, the question that never gets answered, the chapter that never gets written, the day that never comes when someone finally tells you what happened to the person you loved. Sapphire Mendez has been living inside that grief since May 2021. Since the calls stopped coming and then the call finally came that explained why. She lost not just her mother but the version of her mother who had finally found herself, the artist, the community builder, Q, the woman on the sidewalk who oozed creativity. She lost the future version of that mother too, the one who might have gotten a gallery show someday, or whose paintings might have traveled further than Broadway, or who might have come back to Texas for a visit with a portfolio under her arm and a pride in her that matched the pride her daughter already had in her. That future was taken by someone who is still free. And its absence is a specific, named, particular loss that belongs to Sapphire and to no one else. I don't know where she found that passion to paint, Sapphire said. It takes me so long to find the willingness to be creative, but she just oozed it. Those words, said about a mother by a daughter who is trying to hold on to who her mother was, are the most important words in this entire story. More important than the forensic details. More important than the investigative timeline. More important than the theories about who might have done this or why. because they are the words that tell you what was taken. Not just a life, in the abstract. Not just a case file, in the bureaucratic. But that specific woman, with that specific energy, that specific passion, that specific gift for making things and giving them to the world. That is what is gone. That is what was destroyed. That is the full weight of what has not been answered. Interlaken Park is still there. The trails still wind between the Douglas firs. The cyclists still come in the morning. The light still filters through the canopy in that particular Seattle way, pale and diffuse and beautiful. The stream below the embankment still runs. People walk within a few hundred yards of where Necia was found, every single day, and most of them don't know. Most of them have northwest idea that the park they love is holding this story. That this tree line, this private garden, this shallow unremarkable stream, is the place where a woman named Necia McKendrick took her last breath. But someone knows. Someone who was part of the spring of 2021 in Capitol Hill, someone who moved through those same spaces, who knew Necia or knew someone who knew Necia, who saw something or heard something or was told something that has been sitting in the back of their mind for 3 years, that person knows. Or knows enough. Enough to make a call. Enough to say a name. The Seattle Police Department's homicide tip line is 206233500. You can call anonymously. You don't have to give your name. You only have to give what you carry. There are cases that close. There are families who get phone calls that begin with, "We have someone in custody," and who are left to process what that means, relief and grief and a kind of complicated justice that is never quite what you imagined it would feel like, because nothing about it brings the person back. Nothing in a courtroom restores what was taken. But those families know. They have the answer to the question that has been consuming them. They can say, with certainty, what happened. Necia McKendrick's family does not have that. And as of the making of this documentary, there is no public indication of when or whether they will. That is not a statement about the inevitable failure of the investigation. Cases do break. Witnesses do come forward. Memories that were buried for years surface. Evidence that was collected and preserved, DNA, digital records, physical forensics, can be reanalyzed with new tools and new context and produce results that earlier analysis didn't catch. The Seattle Police Department's cold case unit exists precisely because the passage of time is not only an obstacle. Sometimes it is also the thing that loosens tongues, that changes circumstances, that makes the person who was protecting a secret decide that the protection is no longer worth the weight of it. There is a specific kind of hope that lives in families of murder victims whose cases are unsolved. It is not a comfortable hope. It is not the warm, forward-looking kind of hope that imagines good things coming. It is a harder, more resistant hope, the kind that simply refuses to accept that this is how the story ends. That refuses to believe that whoever did this to Necia will live their entire life without consequence. That holds onto the possibility of the phone call, the break, the moment when the open loop finally closes. And Wolf Anderson holds that hope. Sapphire Mendez holds it. The whole McKendrick family holds it, at the cost it costs to hold it, across the years that pass without an answer. And there is something that each of us can do, each person watching this, in whatever location, on whatever device, under whatever covers or on whatever couch, to be part of keeping that hope alive. Not by solving the case ourselves. Not by speculating publicly about suspects in ways that could compromise the investigation. But by saying her name. By sharing this story. By making sure that the algorithm doesn't quietly bury Necia McKendrick in the avalanche of content that moves over every story eventually. By being the person who sends this video to someone who might have known her. By being the reason that the right person sees it and finally decides that 3 years is long enough to carry what they know. Necia McKendrick was 45 years old. She was born in Texas into a family that loved her fiercely and imperfectly and completely. She raised 3 children. She fought through years of darkness and found, in Seattle, in the streets of Capitol Hill, in the painting she did with a passion her daughter could barely describe, a version of herself that felt free. She was Q. She was Queen. She was the woman on the sidewalk who oozed creativity, who sponsored others in recovery, who volunteered and mentored and built community in the places that community is hardest to build. She was getting started. She was just getting started. And someone took that from her. Took her from her family. Took her from her daughter. Took her from the sidewalk on Broadway where she stood with her paintings and offered them to the world. She deserved better than this. She deserved better than a shallow stream and 7 days of silence in a case that has spent 3 years going cold. She deserved the police call and the arrest and the trial and the verdict that tells her family, unambiguously, that what happened to her mattered. That she mattered. That Q mattered. That Queen mattered. That Necia McKendrick mattered. She did matter. She does matter. And this story does not end here, in the absence of an answer. It ends, if it ends, when someone picks up the phone. Seattle Police Department Homicide Unit Tip Line, 20623350000. Anonymous tips, seattle.gov/police. Say her name. Say it again. Necia McKendrick. Tell people. Share this. Don't let the algorithm bury her again. And if you made it all the way to the end of this story, if you stayed with Necia from that cold open through all of this, I want you to know that that matters too. You chose to give your time to learning someone's name. You chose to care about a woman whose case should have had 100 times more attention than it received. That choice is not nothing. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you feel. Tell me where you're watching from and what this story did to you. I read every comment. The conversation in the comments section of a video like this one is part of how cases stay alive, part of how the people who know something realize that the community around a case is real and paying attention, that coming forward isn't stepping into a void but into a room full of people who are listening. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe to this channel if you want to make sure you never miss another story that deserves to be told. Share it, please share it, because somewhere in the reach of that share there might be the person who knows the name that everyone needs to hear. Somewhere in the trees of Interlaken Park, in the memory of someone who was on Capitol Hill in the spring of 2021, in the conscience of whoever has been living with this for 3 years, somewhere, the answer exists. Necia's family is still waiting. The rest is up to all of us.